Margaret wheeled herself through the glass doors of Rosie's diner, just as she had every Tuesday afternoon for the past 3 years, since the accident that changed everything about her life, except her spirit. The familiar smell of coffee and apple pie welcomed her like an old friend, and she made her way to her usual spot by the large windows, where the afternoon sun painted everything in golden light. At 19, Margaret had learned that the world could be both beautiful and cruel sometimes, within the same hour, sometimes within the same moment. But she held on to the beautiful parts with both hands. Behind the counter, Rosie looked up from wiping down the coffee machine and smiled, that warm, maternal smile that had welcomed travelers and locals alike for over 30 years. The usual, honey. Rosie called out, knowing Margaret would want her chocolate milkshake and a piece of that famous apple pie. Margaret nodded and pulled out her worn paperback copy of Pride and Prejudice, settling in to read while she waited for her treat. The afternoon was peaceful, with only a few other customers scattered throughout the red vinyl booths, until the door chimed again, and 3 young men walked in, with the kind of swagger that usually meant trouble. They looked to be in their early 20s, with expensive sneakers and an attitude that suggested they had never been told no about anything important. They slid into the booth directly behind Margaret, speaking loud enough to make sure everyone could hear their conversation about their weekend plans and their opinions about everyone and everything around them. "Look at that," one of them said, and Margaret felt her stomach tighten as she realized they were talking about her. "What do you think happened to her?" another one asked with a cruel laugh. Margaret tried to focus on her book, but the words blurred as she heard their whispered comments growing bolder and more hurtful. "Probably deserved it somehow," the third one said, and Margaret felt tears threatening to spill. She had dealt with stares and whispers before, but something about being trapped in this booth with them right behind her made her feel smaller than she had in months. When Rosie brought her milkshake and pie, Margaret tried to smile, but her hands were shaking slightly as she reached for the glass. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Rosie asked quietly, noticing the tension. Before Margaret could answer, one of the young men behind her made a comment about how pathetic it was to see someone like her trying to act normal in public. The cruelty in his voice cut through the warm atmosphere of the diner like a cold winter wind. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. But she had learned long ago that fighting back sometimes made things worse. She tried to take a sip of her milkshake, but her hands were trembling too much and some of it spilled onto the table. The young men erupted in laughter, pointing at the small mess as if it were the funniest thing they had ever seen. "Can't even drink properly," one of them said loud enough for the whole diner to hear. Margaret felt completely alone in that moment, surrounded by strangers who either didn't notice what was happening or chose to look away. She fumbled for napkins, trying to clean up the spill while fighting back tears of frustration and humiliation. That's when one of them stood up and walked over to her table. "Hey," he said, standing too close. "My friends and I were wondering what your story is." Margaret looked up at him, trying to find her voice, but fear had stolen her words. "I mean, what kind of person ends up like this?" he continued with false concern that made his cruelty even worse. "Did you do something stupid? Or were you just unlucky?" Margaret felt her face grow hot, and she wished she could disappear into the vinyl seat. The young man reached out as if to touch her wheelchair, and Margaret instinctively pulled back. "Please leave me alone," she whispered, but her voice was so quiet it barely carried across the table. "What was that?" he said, leaning closer. "Speak up, we can't hear you." His friends laughed from their booth, encouraging him to continue. Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage her grandmother had always told her she possessed. But before she could respond, the young man did something that crossed every line of human decency. He raised his hand and slapped her across the face. The sound echoed through the diner like a gunshot, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. Margaret's hand flew to her cheek where a red mark was already forming, and tears finally spilled down her face. Rosie dropped the coffee pot she was holding and it shattered on the floor, but she didn't seem to notice. "Get out," Rosie yelled, marching toward them with more fury than her small frame seemed capable of containing. "Get out of my diner right now before I call the police." The three young men looked surprised that anyone would stand up to them, but they weren't. Finished with their cruelty. Relax, lady. The one who had hit Margaret said, "We were just having a conversation." "That's what you call hitting a defenseless young woman." Rosie shot back, "A conversation? She's not defenseless." Another one said, "She's just broken." The words hung in the air like poison, and Margaret felt something inside her break a little more. But the young men had apparently grown bored with their entertainment because they tossed some money on their table and headed for the door. "Thanks for the show," one of them called back to Margaret as they left. The diner fell into an uncomfortable silence as everyone processed what had just happened. Rosie hurried over to Margaret with ice wrapped in a clean towel. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry," she said gently, applying the ice to Margaret's swollen cheek. "Some people are just rotten to the core and there's no explaining it." Margaret nodded, but couldn't trust her voice to speak. She felt ashamed and angry and confused about why some people seemed to take pleasure in hurting others. The other customers went back to their meals and conversations, but Margaret could feel their sideways glances, and she just wanted to go home. She finished her milkshake quickly, despite her stinging cheek, and left money on the table for Rosie. "You don't have to pay, honey," Rosie said. But Margaret insisted. She had learned that maintaining her dignity meant paying her own way, even when the world tried to make her feel like a charity case. Margaret wheeled herself toward the door, feeling defeated and small. The afternoon sun that had seemed so welcoming an hour ago now felt harsh and unforgiving. She sat in her car for a long time, trying to compose herself before driving home. The red mark on her cheek would fade, but the memory of their cruelty would stay with her much longer. She thought about her grandmother, who had always said that kindness was the most important thing a person could offer the world. But today kindness had seemed in very short supply. Margaret drove home slowly, taking the long way through the tree-lined streets of her neighborhood, where she knew every house and most of the people who lived in them at home. She sat by her bedroom window looking out at the garden her mother had planted years ago. The roses were blooming, and the sight of something beautiful growing despite the challenges of weather and time made her feel a little better. She touched her cheek gently and wondered if she would ever feel safe going out in public again. The cruelty of strangers was something she had never quite gotten used to. But as the sun set that evening, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret decided she wouldn't let those three young men take away her Tuesday tradition. Rosie's diner had been a sanctuary for her, and she refused to let anyone steal that away. The next Tuesday afternoon, Margaret took a deep breath and wheeled herself through the glass doors of the diner once again. Rosie looked up immediately and smiled that same warm welcome, but Margaret could see the concern in her eyes. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Rosie asked gently. "Better," Margaret said, and meant it. "I won't let them win." She settled into her usual spot by the windows and opened her book. The afternoon was peaceful, with the familiar sounds of coffee cups clinking and quiet conversations. Margaret was halfway through her milkshake when she heard the rumble of motorcycle engines outside. She looked up to see 5 large motorcycles pulling into the parking lot. The riders were big men with leather vests and bandanas, but something about the way they parked carefully and walked slowly toward the diner suggested they weren't looking for trouble. They filed through the door one by one, and Margaret noticed that despite their intimidating appearance, they were polite to Rosie. "Afternoon, ma'am," the first one said, tipping an imaginary hat. "Mind if we grab a table?" "Of course not," Rosie replied. "Sit anywhere you like." They chose a large booth near Margaret, and she couldn't help but notice that the man sitting closest to her had kind eyes despite his fierce appearance. His name tag read Frank, and he had the weathered hands of someone who worked with them for a living. As they settled in, Margaret overheard pieces of their conversation. They were talking about a charity ride they had organized for children with disabilities, raised over $5,000 this year. Frank was saying, "Should be enough to buy 3 new wheelchairs for kids who need them." Margaret found herself listening more intently as they discussed the various ways they tried to help their community. These men, who looked like they could intimidate anyone, were actually using their reputation to raise money for people who needed help. Frank caught her listening and smiled at her. Sorry if we're being too loud, he said. We're not used to indoor voices. Margaret smiled back. You're not too loud at all. I'm Frank, he said, and these are my brothers. He introduced the other 4 men, and Margaret could see that despite their tough exteriors, they were genuinely kind people. I'm Margaret, she said.